throughout the conversation, thank you, throughout the conversations yesterday and this morning, all issues are pointing to the importance of what the teacher does in the classroom, right? And the steps that are going to be necessary to strengthen the ability of classroom educators to do the work in an environment in which we have raised the standards and the challenge for everybody. We have an excellent panel here this morning that's going to talk about that issue. Our moderator for the panel is Nick Anderson, who's the education editor for the Washington Post. I'm going to turn this session over to Nick, who will introduce the rest of the panel and begin the discussion. Thank you, Nick.
Hi. Well, I was just noticing here, we have from your right to your left, and I don't know if that's a coincidence.
I was thinking I was to your right, Nick.
We have Paul Pastorek. He's the General Counsel, Corporate Secretary at EADS of North America. From 2007 to 2011, Paul was the Commissioner of the Louisiana Department of Education. Got a lot of attention in Louisiana for some of the reform efforts down there. He's credited with directing the state's efforts to turn around more than 100 of Louisiana's most challenged schools, a lot of work after Hurricane Katrina. He's also served on the Louisiana Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. To Paul's right, we have Tom Kane. Tom is the Deputy Director of Education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and in that capacity is deeply involved in studying effective teaching. He's also a professor of education economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, previously a professor at UCLA. To his right, Rob Weil, Deputy Director for the Educational Issues Department of the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, where he is responsible for urban education. And at the Washington Post, we take a deep interest in that in our hometown, including, Rob is also involved in studying how school improvement efforts are implemented at the district level, the school level, and the classroom level. He taught high school in Douglas County, Colorado for 20 years, and he developed and implemented numerous improvement efforts there, including the school district's performance pay plan for teachers, which has become a model around the country. To Rob's right, Dennis Van Rokel, president of the National Education Association, the nation's largest teachers union, 3.2 million members, I believe. He is considered a national leader on education issues, a member of the U.S. Department of Education's Equity and Excellence Commission, which is tasked with studying and recommending solutions to issues about inequitable school finance systems and the effect they have on student achievement. He also was a teacher himself, a mathematics teacher at Paradise Valley High School in Phoenix. Okay, so I'm going to ask a couple of opening questions, and then we'll just go right to you. We're not going to go with opening statements, but this is a question that's perhaps designed to get a little bit of your opening philosophy. And the first question here is, what role does teacher effectiveness play in this effort to get all students college and career ready? I'd like to ask Paul this, and Paul, if you could give us some examples of your thinking.
So in Louisiana, we've made this very important and pivotal role in our effort to build world-class education. Until 4 months ago, that was my job to pursue that objective for all of the children in Louisiana. We're one of the lowest performing states in the country, so we have a long way to go. We decided that we would focus very heavily on teacher evaluations for a number of reasons. Number one, we know that our evaluation system in Louisiana existing is not effective. It evaluates 97 to 99% of teachers, depending on which category you look at, as successful. And we know that that's not the case, and teachers tell us that's not the case, principals tell us that's not the case, but nonetheless, the evaluation system that we have is not working. Number two, we know that all entities that operate, whether in business and public affairs, or in communities outside the United States, have evaluation systems, and many of these are effective. So the question for us became, how do we make this effective? And understanding that the object of the exercise is not to fire people, the object of the exercise is to improve people. Now, I think the final point I would make is that we can't look at teacher effectiveness simply by evaluation systems. It has to be in a context where support is provided. One of the things that I learned from terrific educators when I first took this job back in 2007 from Dr. Michael Fullen was you need to have a system of pressure and support. It can't just all be pressure. It can't be just all accountability. It can't just be all evaluation. It has to be evaluation with support. It has to be accountability with support. So what we've striven for in Louisiana is to put together a support strategy that works in concert with the evaluation strategy. And if you do that, you will drive a higher quality of teaching and learning in the classroom, which will lead to the world-class education goal that we sought to attain.
Great, thanks. Now, Tom, you're involved in the Measures of Effective Teaching project at the Gates Foundation. Maybe with a little bit of insight from that, can you tell us your thoughts on sort of what role effective teaching plays in advancing college and career ready for all students?
Well, for at least 40 years, we've known that there are huge differences in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms. And yet, for those 40 years, we never tried to identify just what are the things, what could we be doing to try to measure and identify our most effective teachers. So there's a huge amount of catching up to do. Yeah, I know much of what we're talking about today and the developments in Race to the Top will feel like a big rush, but the important thing is to recognize that we're just catching up from 40 years worth of ignoring the evidence. So one of the key things we need to be doing is figuring out what are the measures that help you identify effective teaching. One, I believe, is student achievement gains, but it shouldn't be the only thing. We need to develop meaningful approaches to classroom observation. We need to, I would argue, develop meaningful ways of getting feedback from students and parents, because they're in the classroom every day and they see strengths and weaknesses. This is the way higher education provides feedback on instruction. So I think actually with that combination, student achievement gains, a meaningful classroom observation, and student feedback, you can provide exactly the kind of signals to teachers and to their supervisors that we're seeking to do.
Rob, do you think we're paying too much attention to teacher effectiveness? Are we overlooking other issues in this focus on effectiveness?
Well, I first want to talk, I'll answer this differently. I think our focus on teacher effectiveness, Paul's and Tom's comments, I hear this and a lot of people, everybody talks about how this is all about improving teaching. And we all agree with that, and the best way to use teacher assessment, teacher evaluation is for the improvement. Unfortunately, what we see in places and states and school districts that I work in, my job is at the local level, many school districts are only working on identifying the teachers for dismissal and not really doing the support stuff that Paul talked about. In fact, many times it's not even in the room when we're talking. This is where all kids won't get help from this process. And then so the idea here is we do need to have a little bit of a reset, because a lot of this came out of the debate, that the bad teacher debate, and so we have to create a system to find those bad teachers. We need a reset to say this is about teacher effectiveness for all classrooms, regardless of where they are. good teachers being better, excellent teachers even growing, all the teachers, and that's what this is about. Unfortunately, that is not the driver that we see. That's not the driver we see out of Race to the Top. That's not the driver we see out of a lot of these state laws. In fact, my job is to look at those and to implement those things around the country, and many times we see those things, although they might be mentioned, they're not part of the requirements for putting the system in place. They are mentioned, but not required. And then school districts, especially in this time with very tough resources, they go into a compliance mode. What do we have to do to comply with whether the federal regulations are or the state regulations? And we drop off the support or the learning aspect of teacher evaluation or teacher effectiveness. Added to that, a direct answer to your question, it is exactly what Paul talked about. It is, if you're seriously concerned about the learning that goes in the classroom, teacher effectiveness is the core thing within the school, but you also have to look at the things that affect learning beyond just the teacher, if you're serious about moving all children to their potential, because those things matter. That's the evidence. And that if we don't look at those things as well, we are ignoring more of the evidence, more of the 40 years evidence that's out there. So we must look at the evidence regardless and take on those things. It's not that we do one or the other, but if we're serious about student learning, we have to do it all. We can't sit there and say, this one now. It's got to be more of a coherent approach to taking on overall student achievement for all kids.
Dennis, what does the NEA think of the teacher effectiveness movement?
I think it's absolutely where we ought to be focusing. And I think our problem is we tend to focus once they're there. And if you look at the international countries who are leading the way, none of them are doing what we're doing. In this country, 47% of all teachers hired leave in their first 5 years. And in the last 2 years, there's been such a huge debate and time and attention focused on the process of getting rid of incompetent teachers. That process should be well-defined, efficient, and effective. But if you really think that if you make that process efficient and effective, you've solved the problem of having effective teachers in the classroom, I think you're totally wrong. I don't think there's a business, large or small, anywhere that could have a 50% turnover and then say their biggest problem is getting rid of the bad ones that are still there. If that's true, your recruitment, training, and hiring practices are totally broken. And what we ought to be doing, if you want to focus on effective teaching in the classroom, we ought to deal with quality at the front door. I was at a session where the Minister of Education from Finland was asked, what do you do in Finland about incompetent teachers? And he said, we don't have any. And the audience kind of chuckled, and he was surprised by the reaction. He said, no, I'm serious. He said, I guess you could turn into an alcoholic and would have to get rid of you. He said, but if you're not effective, you would never be allowed in a classroom. Very different philosophy. We want to open the door wide, let anybody in. And if you're really horrible, we'll make it easy to get rid of you. I think that's wrong. I don't want my kids, my grandkids, in a class where someone is allowed in to see if teaching is their profession. I have way too much respect for the profession. I think we ought to not allow anyone into a classroom with 30 or 35, and in this fall, 40 and 45 kids who isn't fully trained, licensed, and certified. And so to me, what we do wrong is we take a part of that whole system and we say, let's change this piece. And then it'll all change. It won't work, I don't believe. I think you have to look at that system. It starts with recruitment and training. We don't recruit. We wait to see who shows up at a college of education or some other way of getting into the profession. We don't have a recruitment system. The training system, we're getting a lot of attention placed on that, and that's good. Looking at clinical practice. You know, one of the things we need to make sure is, we need to make sure that teaching is your profession. And we ought to know that before we put you in there. Just because you do well in school, or maybe if you don't, doesn't necessarily make the connection that your profession is teaching. We lose a lot of that 47% in the first 5 years because they find out this is not what I want to do. We should be able to figure that out long before they get into a classroom as teacher of record. The other thing on how that system connects, I hear a lot about recruiting from the top 1/3, but they never talk about the compensation system. Those are connected. If you want to recruit the top 1/3 of science, math majors, you can't be in the lower 1/3 of pay. They're connected. It's a system. So I think we're on absolutely right track. I think we need to deal with the quality of the profession and bring it back to being a true profession instead of doing what people are trying to do to say anyone can be a teacher.
I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up. In the last couple of years, I've been interested to see discussion about evaluation of teachers, and oftentimes for us reporters, it focuses on what portion of an evaluation should be based on some kind of standardized test metric, some kind of data. And some states have said 50%, some places say 40%, 30%. It's kind of like there's a recipe out there that people are looking for and groping for. And I wondered if each of you, starting with Paul, because I know Louisiana gave this some thought, could talk to us about what portion of a teacher's evaluation ought to be based on some kind of objective test-related measure, and whether that's a valid thing to do.
So I think it's extremely important, because I think we're kidding ourselves if we're just going to look at what are the input approvals and requirements that must be met. And to take a little bit of an issue with Mr. Van Roykel, if we simply say that the issue is letting people in who are fully certified, fully qualified, there are a lot of people who come in fully certified and fully qualified that are bad teachers and need a heck of a lot of improvement. And then there are a lot of people who come in and need a lot of training. They don't come in ready to go and fully prepared. So I think we have to look at balancing the inputs with the outputs and measuring the outputs, fairly measuring the outputs. In Louisiana, we adopted a 50% model. We had a big dialogue with both of the unions about that percentage. And there was not unanimity with the unions, and there was not full agreement. But at the end of the day, we elected to go with 50%.
50% of what exactly?
50% of the total evaluation of a teacher would be based on student academic achievement. And 50% would be based on principal observations and other factors. And right now, we will start next year full implementation. We're actually in trial implementation on this basis. But I want to emphasize, the student academic achievement measures are not designed to an absolute scale where all teachers are measured to the best child. But in fact, what we do is we look at the populations of kids and match those populations of kids with the teachers so that we can compare progress and value added by the teacher for the same populations of kids. So if you're teaching a poor child and Tom is teaching a poor child and Rob is teaching a wealthy child, then those teachers will not be matched against each other unless they're teaching the same kind of children. So what we're really looking for is, what is the student academic achievement for the same kinds of kids? And with all due respect, to outside factors, Rob, I mean, yes, outside factors matter, but there are many teachers who are able to overcome outside matters by their teaching capacity. And what we ought to look at with our evaluation systems is the information, identification of those teachers who are doing well with challenged kids, to be able to share that information with those who are not doing well with challenged kids. So in Louisiana, 50% was deemed to be a measure. Now, is there a magic rule to determine how you get to 50%? My argument was simply this. We know it isn't a perfect testing system that we have, and we know that we're in our infancy on using student academic achievement and value added for the purposes which we are trying to use for teacher evaluation. So rather than use it for 100%, which would make sense to me, let's use it for 50%. Now, the reason I would go with 50% and not, as other states, 40, 30, 20, is because in Louisiana we have been using value-added data to measure our first and second year teachers and hold the teacher preparations accountable for the outcomes. 100% of the accountability formula for our teacher preparation programs is based on the effectiveness and value added for first and second year teachers. So we're not new to this in Louisiana. Dr. George Knoll has been working on this in Louisiana for 7 years. Dr. Gene Burns, building this teacher evaluation system, which is based on comparing like teacher population, student populations with like teacher student
How about
populations.
Tom? What do you think of this?
So, I think in the past year, states have had to make decisions about weighting based on the best available judgment rather than the best available evidence. And because there's not been a whole lot of evidence so far to help guide those decisions.
So they're guessing.
Well, they're guessing, but understandably, somebody's got to make a decision. Now, what we're hoping to do is to help inform those decisions in the future by saying, okay, what would be the weights that are most predictive of some outcome? So we're looking at saying, okay, well, suppose that you were trying to identify the teachers who over the next 5 or 6 years would be likely to have the largest student achievement gains. What would be the weights that you'd use on this year's student achievement gains, this year's student feedback, this year's classroom observations that maximize your ability to predict that? We could also say, so not everybody's going to be crazy about using student achievement gains. We could also say, well, suppose that your goal was to identify the teachers that over the next 5 or 6 years would be most likely to have students say things like, I do my best work in this teacher's class. Well, what would be the weights that you'd apply to test scores, student achievement gains, and classroom observations to best predict that outcome? So the weights ought to be based on some sort of idea about what are you trying to predict? Who are you trying to identify? And different states will make different decisions about what outcomes they want to be predicting, but we're going to try to provide some evidence to help inform those decisions in probably around December, January. We'll have a report that'll come out that'll say what's the weighting that would maximize.
So fear not, states. The Gates Foundation will give us the answer.
Exactly.
No,
Fear
no.
not.
We'll provide some evidence to help inform decisions.
Rob, which states are getting this right?
This is a tough one because I think there's another way to say this stuff. First of all, I want to say that, at AFT we understand there's an inherent link between teaching and learning, and we don't run away from that. In fact, we embrace it. But the deal here is about what are we talking about when we talk about learning? And are we going to narrow learning down to a single measure, or are we going to talk about what we want kids to know and be able to do across the curriculum? The states went into the 50% and 40%. I realize the difference between a political decision and an educational one because they're made all the time. And a lot of the, like Tom's talking about, this is exactly where, where the policy was way ahead of the research on when it comes to weighting. There is, Tom talks logically about how to move this, how to logically think about this stuff, and they're going to come out with weights. But again, there's going to be political decisions about all those things. But the biggest thing we also have to think about what's covered in this. And one of the things right now we're dealing with is people talk about testing. Many places don't have tests in a lot of subjects to do this work. And so, when we hear people use all the language about, 50% of a teacher's evaluation is going to be on student learning, and then you talk about in many places, a majority of the teachers in the system, it all falls apart because nobody's thought about it. They haven't taken the time. It's time for us to stop working like that with education and just thinking about getting it done instead of getting it right. This is why we're in the boat we're in right now. We don't take on those tough problems. We don't think about what is a real good What are good measures of student learning? It's not that we would walk away from some of the measures that are out there now, but what are additional measures that can also strengthen those measures as well? And we don't see that happening around this country. We've got our measure and we're going to use it and we're going to drive it into the ground. I will go back to, some of these other, I've been lucky enough to go to places like Finland and other countries around the world and how they do it. Even the countries that use data, like the Asian countries and those, and really push it, it's not used in the same way we use it here. In fact, one of the things that, I do want to share with this group is, if you're familiar with OECD and the PISA reports and all the different stuff they talk about, Andre Schleicher is the lead researcher on that. His language is, the United States looks at accountability uniquely to the world. He's not, and we have to look at that and say, what can we learn not only here at home, but abroad to help us educate our kids better? And so some of the things we're doing around improving education are perceived as improving it could be counterproductive. And I'm going to go back to what Paul was saying about, they do grade alike or job alike teachers and use value added with those teachers. That is an absolute realization that these other things matter. And so if we want to deal with it, I agree there are teachers that are the different effectiveness. We don't have any, but when you talk about the system of learning from each other, we haven't seen that. Where has that been about the big system where we all learn from each other? Teachers don't have time in schools to learn from each other because they're running from here to there. We don't set that up. Now, there are some schools that are really trying to do that, but I'll be honest with you, in this last year with the resources, we see a lot of that effort cut because there's not enough money to do it. We're going the wrong way right now, but there are solutions, there are answers if we just make commitment to looking at this problem holistically. What Dennis was talking about with the pipeline, how we support the teachers that are existing teachers we have, and then also what kind of supports. I'll say it this way. Teachers want the data to help them improve their instruction. They want it, but they don't want to have to wait to the end of the year to get it because you're not improving their instruction tomorrow. The idea is, if you're going to improve instruction, work on things that teachers can use tomorrow, because that's when they want to improve instruction with their kids tomorrow. That will help.
Dennis, I got a question for you. So Paul came up with, and Louisiana came up with a recipe of 50%. 50% of an evaluation should be based on student growth data. Is your preferred recipe 0%?
No, it isn't.
What percentage would it be?
I don't think that should come from a national level or a state level dictating to a district. This is the number. It's 50, it's 40, it's 65. I think that ought to be done in collaboration at the district level. And what they need to take into account is, number one, what is the purpose of this? What are we trying to achieve? Number two, do we have the adequate measures? See, I believe that every teacher ought to be able to demonstrate evidence of student learning. We only have a math and reading test. Half the teachers aren't even covered by that, and the tests they're using aren't valid. So to me, if we agree that evidence of student learning is really important to know, then the next step is defining the adequate measures of that. National Board of Professional Teaching Standards said we ought to be able to quantify what teachers ought to know and be able to do. 20 years, they spent $200 million, and they have assessments for all levels in all subject matters. They invested in that. The problem here is that we don't have the measures, and we are already moving to high-stakes decisions. I think they're going to kill an idea that has a lot of potential. One other point. In the countries that are doing very well, they don't put this high emphasis on standardized tests. It's kind of what Rob was saying. They do more on formative assessments that are through the year. The other thing they do very differently is they don't try to do it on an individual teacher basis, like Rob's better than Dennis. What they do is they focus on the students. What's working? And so they spend far more time in collaboration to say, with this group of students, this particular practice seems to be getting better results. What does that tell us? What do we need to do more of or less of? They do far more collaboration about practice instead of trying to label individual students or teachers. And if we don't have evidence of student learning, that doesn't even make sense.
Okay.
But to use a system that doesn't have a valid measure for high stakes tests, you're going to ruin it. Pretty soon people say this is stupid and they'll throw it out.
So your view on this essentially is, yes, student growth data should be part of a teacher's evaluation, but we don't have good student growth data right now, so we can't use that data?
No, and we need to focus on developing it because teachers want and need it. Teachers want and need more data, not less. You know, it's really interesting. As a school district or as an individual teacher, to know the difference of how my students are achieving and knowing how many days they were in my class, or how many, meaning not only by absentee rate, we have schools in Arizona that have 75 to 90% turnover in a year. Now, I don't think we should say, well, we can't do anything for these kids because they're real transient. No. But what we ought to be focusing on is what works best when you only have a kid a short period of time in your class. Or if they're absent a lot, what are the things we're going to do to catch them up? I mean, I can't teach someone who's not there. So we ought to focus on what's working with students instead of ignoring the students, focusing on this all-important test score and believing that you can define what I do in a classroom by a test given on 3 hours, 1 day of the year.
Okay, we have hundreds of you from around the country who are on the quest for effective teaching. So surely you have some questions, specific questions for these folks. Why don't we start over here? Just say what state you're from and...
Carrie White from Oklahoma. Rob and Dennis both talked about the non-tested grades and subjects teachers. I'd like to hear from Paul and Tom on that topic. What do you do with those non-tested grades and subjects?
I think you have to come up with alternate measures, and in fact, in Louisiana, that's a big issue. We have English language arts, math, science, and social studies that are administered 3rd through 9th, and then we have an array of high school tests, which aren't nearly enough to cover all. And in fact, right now, it probably covers about 40% of teachers. We're going to, they're working right now in collaboration with 200 teachers from around the state to put together instruments which will be able to be common to all districts and all schools. We're going to bring into the umbrella of the standardized testing, if you will, about 55% of teachers. There's another manner that we're working on as well to come up with not so standardized methods that would capture about another 30 to 35% of teachers. We still will end up with about 10 to 15% of teachers that we don't have an answer for at this point in time. And I do agree that it would be delightful if we had all of those teachers covered. But we do have the information on those teachers which are covered, and we ought to be using that information. We shouldn't ignore the information. But it is a challenge, and I do think, and I agree with Rob on this point, the policy is a bit ahead of the ability to actually deliver on this, and we have to be very careful, and we have to be very thoughtful. But to call a recess at this point, when kids are counting on adults to get it right, I think is not the right answer. I really do believe that this is a problem that you've just pointed out. And I think if good people of goodwill who have agreed here today, it's not whether we should do this or not, it's how we should do it. So fine, if it's not whether, it's how, then let's be about the business of answering the how question. Let's not just say no to this. Let's not just show all of the weaknesses in the system. There are weaknesses. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Let's come together. Let's work together, which we tried very hard to do in Louisiana, and we were very successful with one of the two unions in working very collaboratively on this point. But we had agreement, even with both of the unions, that it's not whether, it's how. So let's work on the how. But let's hurry up. Let's adults get about the business. You know, the ABA is a bit of a union if you look at it, the American Bar Association. You know, we have rules and the association takes action. It shows initiative. It shows focus on creating rules to get rid of bad lawyers in the profession. And so I would like to see not people just saying no. I would like to see the unions come forward with the alternatives. Let's come forward with real, specific alternatives to address the problem of coverage. Because I will tell you that the initial returns on the pilot, we're piloting in almost half of the districts in Louisiana, and the initial returns are very favorable. Teachers are coming forward and saying, we like it. And I agree, Rob, we ought to have formative assessments. We ought to have next day assessments. That ought to be a part of the dialogue. In fact, that's what PARC and Smarter Balanced is all about. PARC is more heavily focused on formative, Smarter Balanced on the other. I've already forgot now. I've been away for 4 months. But, you know, we ought to have both of those things. And I agree that, you know, maybe we ought not be spending all of our energy on one test. Well, fine. What is the solution? And if the teacher unions are representing teachers, most teachers want the bad teachers to improve or get out. That's my experience. My wife was a teacher. My sister is a teacher. That's what they want. I think the unions ought to be driving this train toward the best effective evaluation based on student academic achievement.
I want a quick answer from Tom, but since you just brought up the unions, and I'd like to have an answer from Rob or Dennis on the point you just made. So Tom, how do we cover, quickly, how do we cover those teachers that aren't included in testing?
So I'll try to keep it really short. I do hope that PARC and Smarter Balance will help on this, because the Common Core standards, as you know, talk about literacy, not English language arts. And so there are aspects of literacy involved in science, in history, in social science, and hopefully those assessments will help somewhat with the coverage issue by adding some literacy items in these other content areas. The second point, though, that I wanted to make on this is that there's an inexpensive way to get a reliable, predictive measure in all grades and subjects using student feedback. You know, so what we've learned is that these student questionnaires that we are using as part of the Measures of Effective Teaching project yield measures that are reliable, actually more reliable than many other types of measures, particularly classroom observations are hard to get a good reliability score on. These student feedback measures give you reasonable reliability. They're predictive. They're related to student achievement gains. They're relatively inexpensive. And I think an important underappreciated fact is they're measured in units that teachers care about. So if I'm a teacher, you show me my student achievement gains, and they're below what you and I would expect them to be. There's a lot in the newspapers these days that will allow me to not take that very seriously, to say, well, you know, we know that these tests aren't reliable tests. So rather than have me respond positively to this feedback, there's a lot in the general public debate right now that will lead me to want to put it aside. Now, if you add to that a classroom observation, say my classroom observation is also weak, I'm going to say, well, you know, my principal is a phys ed teacher. What do they know about what do they know about math? So if that's all you've got, you've bred alienation rather than motivation. But if on top of that you show people, here's what the students are saying. Your students are saying, look, when they turn in homework, they don't get useful feedback that helps them improve.
How old do the students have to be to give useful feedback?
Well, one of the surprising things is that we tested down to grade 4.
Grade 4?
And the relationship between these student evaluation scores and value added in 4th and 5th grade was no lower than it was in 5th through 8th grade. So even down to grade 4, it's predictive. There's probably some grade range where you wouldn't want to go below, but the nice thing about these student feedback measures is that there's no teacher that won't care when their students say, we don't use time well in this class and we waste time, or I don't get useful feedback that helps me improve, or my teacher doesn't know me and doesn't have high expectations for me. Those are the things that teachers care about and that they'll learn from, and that it's much harder to just discard and ignore. It's much more likely to breed motivation rather than alienation.
Okay, I want to go to Rob and Dennis to respond to what Paul said, but I think it'd be better to do that within the framework of another question because we got more questions here. So let's go here.
Good morning. My name's Mary Ann Snyder. I'm from Rhode Island, and we are knee-deep in educator evaluation issues, both the technical, the context, the policy, and the politics. And I'm wondering, we're really trying to focus our evaluation system on providing actionable feedback to teachers so that they can improve. And that's a hard thing to do. And I'm wondering if, and perhaps having our union representatives talk about this, what is the balance between a district's obligation to support ongoing growth and development and the teachers stepping toward that and owning some of the responsibility, both fiscally, time-wise, all of it. And we're trying to find that balance, and people are asking us to codify that somehow, and we're really struggling with that. So if you could speak to that, I'd really like to hear your perspectives.
Across this country, not just in Rhode Island, but in many places, especially the race to the top states.
Sorry.
Slip of the tongue. Oop.
You just said racist.
Leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
That's my foot. It bothers my tongue. In the race to the top states, there's been a lot of emphasis on developing good evaluation systems, and I think that's great. And there are literally hundreds of places across the country, both with AFT locals and with NEA locals, where they're developing good, solid evaluation systems because everyone wants one. And the sad part is that some places have them and they're not being used, which is, to me, the worst case. Well, maybe it's worse when you don't even have one. Finding that balance, I think, is really important, and it comes through sitting down at a table and deciding that. I talk about collaboration all the time. I've been around a long time. I earned this color hair. And I remember in the 80s, after Nation at Risk, there was a whole lot of ed reform movement, and we were involved in a lot of that. And I saw a lot of stops and starts, things that succeeded and then failed, and way too often they were personality driven. So when the person left, everything fell down and was no longer workable. So to me, the key is that you bring it, the management, administration, or rather management, the administration, the school board, and the employees, they have to come to an agreement, and they need to put it in writing, in an MOU or in a contract, because then no one person leaving changes the system. And to me, that's the success. Professional development is absolutely part and parcel of what you're doing. It's about the practice, and everyone should do that every year. Ontario, Canada, one of the top scoring countries in the world, they do an evaluation of teachers once every 5 years. But every teacher has to have a learning plan every single year. So what they're saying is every single teacher, not those that we think just have problems, we want every single teacher to improve every single year. What that magic balance is who does what. I think that has to come through collaboration. And I think Rob mentioned this. One of the hard things right now is the incredible crunch on resources are making those opportunities disappear. And it's frustrating, I think, both to employees and the school district. They want to do more, and there just aren't resources to do it.
Rob, you have thoughts on the Rhode Island question?
Well, as you know, as somebody from Rhode Island might know, AFT received a I-3 grant to work teacher evaluation in Rhode Island, and we've been in there working with 6 school districts heavily on this exact question and working with them, trying to figure out a way to make teacher evaluation about continuous improvement of the teachers. And what we're finding, not just in Rhode Island and other places, we have another, the I3 also extends to New York. What we're finding places is that as you move to make it more apparent to teachers that this is about their growth and not about making some final judgment, as much about the final judgment, we know there's always going to be that aspect of teacher evaluation. But the more you make it about their continuous improvement, the more they're willing to take on the responsibility of their improvement. The problem is if you have to develop this and work it. This is the hard work that we need to do in this country. This is, creating Excel spreadsheets or Tom's crazy spreadsheets on value added is not as hard as actually figuring out the connection of how you move teachers to a better place. That's the hard work we have to do. And in response to Paul's question, I want to answer, get to that as well. It's more than just talk about doing it. The AF2 stood up at the National Press Club in January of 2010 and talked about that exact thing. We wanted to do that with people. Let's look at other measures. Let's do that. Let's spend the time. We couldn't get any bites. Let me give you a tangible, real-world example of how this works. We were invited in, myself and my team was invited into a large urban school district to help them develop assessments for teacher evaluation. We were given 2 weeks to do it. And nobody from the assessment office from the school district was in the room. That ought to send a message of how serious this work is when we're talking about this other stuff. We need to be serious about this work. It can't be just lip service. And then when we go into places, they sit there and say, oop, that's a lot of hard work to do that, so we're going to just default to what we see. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of places. Unfortunately, it's not good for schools. I'm kind of optimistic about where we're going because I'm starting to see people understanding that the default model is not going to work. But I wish we would not have this impending, well, it's just not going to work, and that's why we have to change. But this is why we have to do things. Again, I visited the Ontario schools. It's amazing how that collaboration improvement process works there. That's what it's all about. And we can do that here. It's not impossible. It's very possible if we change some of our mindset right now it's about the few that we have to find. If we change that mindset and start talking about all we have to improve, we're going to do much better by all children in all schools.
I'm going to give Tom 20 seconds to defend his spreadsheets.
So I think it would be unfair to say that we have neglected professional development. Actually, many states, as you know, and districts have substantial budgets on professional development. The problem is that it's not connected in any way
That's the point.
to evaluation and accountability. And so the dollars there in professional development, if we could figure out a way to connect it so that I'm not just providing you with a general lesson, I'm providing you with help to improve on the thing that's going to allow you to improve your evaluation next year. Now that's going to be individualized. It's going to require complete redesign of our professional development investments, but that's a budget that could be helpful here that is currently, I think, mostly a waste of time.
Other questions?
Nick, can I respond to that? May I? Or if there's another question.
Go ahead.
I want to just show an example of what I'm talking about here. I agree with Tom, and if I wasn't clear about connecting the professional development to the assessment of practice in the classroom, that was my mistake of not being clear. But I also want to say something here about it's like what Paul was talking about was, when he made the announcement of the Bar Association comes up and a way to get rid of bad teachers or bad attorneys. And Tom just talked about how you can improve your evaluation next year. That's the mindset that we have to change. Because hopefully the data and the professional development I'm going to get isn't about doing something that's going to improve my evaluation next year. It's about improving my practice to help kids learn in the classroom. And having that mindset isn't just about my improvement of my evaluation. It's about student achievement and student instruction. And that's if we have that focus. We have to have that focus. That's the shift that has to happen in this country if we're going to have high quality student achievement across the spectrum. And that mindset is a very tough mindset to change. It's embedded right now in our country, and we need to really step back from that and really move forward towards a different mindset of this is tomorrow, like Tom was talking about, formative assessments, giving the information back now so I can improve my classroom, today.
Anybody else have a question out there?
Yeah, I knew I'd get one.
You could ID what state you're from?
Mike Stetter, Delaware. I'd like to follow up on something that Mr. Corcoran had started off the morning with, practices we could borrow from the business sector and play right off of what the two gentlemen have just said. If in fact we don't want to tie professional development monies to improving teacher evaluation, but in fact we want to drive better achievement for all the kids, is there any way we could use quality circles or faculty-empowered professional development to target a problem in practice that they want to solve at their building or to their district? Do you have any feelings as to how we can bring some attention to the freeing up, the flexing of PD monies through Title II or state funds or local funds so that faculties can identify this is what we want to work on, this is what we want to own, and we're willing to stand up and show that we're accountable for plowing in what we've learned in the PD to our kids' benefit?
Okay, so if I understand the question, then we have a viewpoint here of sort of integrating professional development more closely to the evaluation process, and then we have an idea out here of having the teachers and the faculty themselves have some ownership of the professional development dollars and sort of the question about what professional development would be applied to. Does anybody want to take a swing at this? Paul has not talked in a minute. I'll give him.
So, part of the big debate is what is the role of the federal government, state government, district, principal, et cetera. And I would argue that the buzzwords that we ought to be talking about are flexibility with accountability. So if we're going to hold people accountable for improving student academic achievement and for personal evaluations which are based on that, we ought to give them the flexibility to be able to drive the outcomes that we've asked for. Because when we sit back as the state agency and tell people where to spend their money, how to spend their money, et cetera, then we are removing their empowerment and removing real accountability for outcomes, because we're taking it on ourselves. So we ought to stop doing that, and we've made a concerted effort at pulling back the how question and funding in such a way that it's based on performance. Let's go to Title II, or Title I for that matter. Is it performance-based? Do we hold people accountable for the outcomes of those expenditures? But do we tell them nonetheless how to spend that money and restrict it very tightly? It has to be, and you have to check the boxes. I do think that we ought to be able to give these grants more flexibly, but hold people accountable and be clear about what those levels of accountability are. It amazes me, especially as a non-educator who really began to understand these details in earnest over the last 4 years, how misaligned the expenditures of money are and the rules attached to them are to the work that's being done in the classroom. So professional development money, there's no real information that principals have, or even groups of teachers have, upon which to make decisions about those expenditures if they were to be given that kind of autonomy. But now what we're finding, again, with the pilots that are going on in Louisiana, a principal looks at a particular teacher and they consult with each other and says, on the Pythagorean theorem, you're just not really getting it across. You know what? We need to target professional development, and that's the first conversation that has to take place. How are we going to target support to fix this? Because, look, at the end of the day, I disagree with you a little bit, Rob. The mindset should not be, we're going to improve everybody. The mindset should be, first we're going to work to improve everybody, and then if not, we're going to get rid of people. That should be the mindset. And getting rid of people can't be out of the lexicon. But we have to do real support of people. And here's why. As a practical matter, as a state superintendent of education in Louisiana, if I wanted to get rid of all of the people who fell below a very low standard of value added, it would be a lot of people. And there's no way to practically replace those people in any reasonable time frame. So if I started out as the primary purpose of this is to get rid of the bad people, we'd be toast. And we'd be toast in America. So as a practical matter, a real matter, there's no hidden agenda here. The main objective should be to get people to improve. And as a last resort, we must include in the dialogue the determination. But it has to be support. So Gates has given us a grant in Louisiana to implement this pilot program and they're helping us a great deal. But they wouldn't even give us the grant for the evaluation development process unless we agreed to a training program around the Common Core standards that we've adopted in Louisiana. They have to go hand in hand. That was the requirement of Gates. And actually it forced us to really do the work around alignment so that teachers would know what they're supposed to do and then targeting professional development can be done.
I'm going to, unless I see any other questions out there, I'm going to jump in with one of my own. I think probably all agree that classroom observation is an essential part of trying to help teachers become effective and evaluating teachers. What makes effective classroom observation? And how many times a year does a teacher have to be observed to come up with a valid sort of read on that teacher's effectiveness? And let's just go down from Dennis on.
Number one, I think we make an assumption that an observation is always by a principal. I believe that's a false assumption. We have a teacher-led school in Denver, Colorado.
Should it be always by a principal?
No, it should not. In Denver, Colorado, we have a teacher-led school, the Science and Math Academy, and all of the observation of teachers is done by their peers. All of the first grade teachers observe the other ones, and then they sit down and talk about practice and kids. I think that's a very positive thing. And what you said, what's the most important part about observation? I think it's the feedback. If you just come in and watch me teach for 20 minutes and leave and I don't hear anything, what good is it? You haven't done anything for me. I've had good ones and I've had bad ones. Good observations who give me good feedback, that gives me an idea of what I could do differently to be more effective, that's powerful. Tied into that, to go back to this question about the quality circles, and professional development tied to that. I want to use one example that I believe incorporates that. There's a small elementary school in Phoenix, high poverty, high crime area, about 75% English language learners, one of the lowest performing. Young lady who was a teacher there decided that she wanted to go for national board certification. She convinced 19 of her colleagues to do it. So a group of 20 teachers, they called them the Mitchell 20, sat down in a year and just all went for national board certification. The power in that wasn't just the national board. It was a group of 20 people who said, let's look at our students and what's happening to them and what do we need to be successful. It wasn't about my evaluation. It was about the students. And they spent that year working together, working for national board certification, but the focus was delivering for our students in our school what they need. Powerful results. And see, I believe you can duplicate that in any school in America. I believe if in every school, all of the adults who work there spent a 40-hour week deciding what they wanted to do together, as their focus for the year to change what's happening to kids, I believe you would change that school. I think it is the power of those people coming together and deciding what they believe will best address the needs of the students. And that's the quality circle concept, as I understand it.
Rob, so if you had to put a number on it, a guess, 3, 4, 5 times a year, what's the right number of times for a teacher to be observed?
Well, I think this is a loaded question because Tom studies this and he's going to do a big
it's a loaded
press
question.
release on this or a big study release on this in a couple months, so it's kind of loaded. But it's multiple times during the school year, and it's best if it's multiple different people. It's best if it's not just the principal and it's not just teachers. It's people who look at teaching a lot of different ways. If you look at how they do, I hate to sound like Mr. International here, but if you look at how they do it in Singapore, they go in with a team of, when they do a teacher observation, they do it with a team of 6 to 8. And they all have a different aspect of teaching they're looking at. And they try to get these different things. You're never going to get rid of the bias a certain person brings to the classroom, so the more different views you can have in the classroom, the better off you're going to be. And so multiple things just logically make a sense because you're going to have those inherent biases. The other thing is, if you don't do observation or the importance of observation in the classroom, you can't connect it back to what the teacher's doing to the student achievement and the student learning. You need to see what the process is going on, what the teaching is happening, and then compare it back and figure out which ones are more effective. You need to be able to see that. So there's a practical reason why you have to see a number of times of what's going on in the classroom, because you want to connect it back to student achievement and then do more of what works and less of what doesn't. That's clear. I'd love our schools to do less of something. The final thing I'm going to say is the gentleman. I do want to mention the thing about the gentleman. Again, I'm going to sound like Captain International here, but Asian countries have been doing lesson study for hundreds of years in their schools. They do that all the time. That's what their whole teacher development system is around, is almost exactly what you're describing in their schools. They get together and talk about student learning. That's what they call, if you're familiar with the lesson study stuff out of Japan, that's where it's most famous out of Japan, but they do it there. That's what they do. And so it is a very successful technique. It's just, unfortunately, in the United States, it's not seen as, it's not caught on. We do have some school districts, I know of a couple in Florida and a couple out west that do try to do lesson study, but it's, the resources get in the way and all those kind of things.
Tom, how much observation is too much?
Yeah, Tom.
So I'll have a hard time answering how much observation is too much, but I can tell you more about how much observation is necessary to have achieve some minimum level of reliability. Think about it. The aspects of instruction that are most likely to be related to student achievement gains are not the aspects that are easily measured, like, is Mr. Kane wearing a tie today? That's easily measured, and I can generate 100% reliability on that just by showing people lots of pictures of ties. But if instead the type of thing that's related to student achievement gains are, did Mr. Kane, with his questioning, get students to effectively describe their own thinking in class? So was the quality of my questioning strategies high enough? Well, that's going to be the kind of thing that's predictive of student achievement gains, but it's actually also hard to measure. It's hard to get a 100% reliable measure of that. So what you got to do is train people and certify people. I've seen districts and states wasting way too much time constructing a new rubric rather than training and certifying people on a rubric that they've chosen. But once you've done that, I think we're learning that it's going to take 3 or 4 observations, and ideally multiple people doing it to generate reliable measures in a classroom observation. And I think that in this space, I hope 5 years from now, there will be dramatic changes in how we think about classroom observation, where it's much more common to do a classroom observation with digital video, so that it's easier to have multiple people provide feedback and to get feedback quickly, and that allows for a system to involve other people other than just the principal doing the observation. Given the low cost of digital video these days, I think 3 or 4 years from now, hopefully, it's a totally different. We're thinking about classroom observation in a totally different way than we've traditionally thought about it.
I think we're at time.
Ready?
So I want to thank everybody for asking the questions and thank the panelists.
Again, I too would like to thank the panelists. This has been a difficult conversation. It's been a very important conversation. It's a conversation that needs to be going on. And while I heard areas of disagreement, I also heard areas of agreement about the balance that's needed in the system to improve effectiveness of educators up and down the line. And mostly what I heard was a sense of urgency about these issues that hasn't always been part of the conversation that's been going on, frankly, since A Nation at Risk, about the things that need to happen differently in professional development and educator evaluation. So I think there's hope here, and I think when we revisit this issue, I hope that we will see progress, that there'll be learning across states as you each wrestle with these issues in different ways. I hope we'll see learnings between the teachers and the states and the unions about how best to tackle these issues. So again, I think this was a very important conversation to be having, and we've got lots to learn, and we've got to do everything we can to support these conversations in the future. So again, thank you for being part of a very important session. We have time for a brief break now. There's coffee and snacks there. And at 10:30, you have a set of breakout sessions that you can choose from, concurrent sessions. So please pick the one that you're most interested in and start there at 10:30. Be back here at 11:45 for the lunch session and a really interesting conversation about the economic environment in which this is operating. Thank you very much.